Today's show makes reference to an essay by our special guest, Frank Bumb. Unfortunately, that essay is not yet finished. Once it is posted, we will add it to the show notes and share it on our social media accounts.
Welcome to the 17th episode of Planetospodcast, a podcast dedicated to the fans of George R. R. Martin's A Song of Ice and Fire and HBO's A Game of Thrones. Spoiler warning, the show will cover all material, including the main series, Dunk and Egg, the novellas, Fire and Blood, The World of Ice and Fire, quotes and interviews by George, and episodes of the show and its commentaries and bonus material. I'm one of your hosts, Brett. You can find me on Twitter at HomelyPillow.
And I'm your other host, Travis. You can find me at Sarah_Travis on Twitter. We hope you enjoy today's show. The human heart in conflict with itself is the only thing worth writing about. That quote is from the American author William Faulkner. George uses that line regularly to describe what he is keen on studying in A Song of Ice and Fire. Within that quote lies the question of what men and women do when confronted with choice and desire. Each day in our own world, we are forced to make decisions, as are George's characters. In his fictional world, the stakes are high, though, whether it's love and duty, honor and pride, war and peace, fear and courage, or revenge and forgiveness. The men and women of Planetos are wrestling with choice in almost every move they make. For some, the answers seem clear and easy. For most, though, they struggle constantly with what to do. We know that George's world is gray and complex. It's realistic in that sense. It's relatable to us as human beings. Yes, we believe that there are right and wrong answers to most questions. But in terms of the story, it seems for many of those decisions, there is never a purely good answer or reason for the choices made. There could be many ways to respond, and one answer can create many obstacles while others create a whole new set of barriers. From the beginning, we have a pretty clear picture of the character Stannis Baratheon. He is a righteous, hard, unforgiving man who seems unafraid and relentless in his pursuit of his rights and the Iron Throne of Westeros. We know he is a smart and capable military commander and lord, but he is not loved by many of the characters in A Game of Thrones. One brother never talks about him, while the other dismisses him as unfit for rule and openly mocks him. The small council japes at his actions and his family, his zealous wife, his disfigured daughter, and Stannis sits off screen like an absent answer to many of the problems and questions that Ned Stark and others face in King's Landing in the first book. What is he doing on Dragonstone? Why isn't he returning to court? What did he and Jon Arryn discover? Why has he taken up with a foreign priestess? So as you can tell, today we're going to discuss one of our favorite characters. We mentioned the human heart in conflict with itself, and Stannis is in conflict from the beginning. But so is the fandom on this character. It seems there are either lovers or haters of the one true king, and very few in between on this very intriguing man. But we think he deserves a second look to understand how this complicated man is perceived both in universe and in the fandom itself, as well as how and why George introduces him to the story. Stannis, like many characters, gives us a great sense of what it is like to deal with conflict and the follies of war and the problems of kingship in the kingdom of Westeros. He is racked by the choices that lay before him from the first moments we meet him in A Clash of Kings. And to help us cover the one true king, we welcome back to our podcast today one of the best Stannermen out there, Mr. Frank Bumb.
I thought it wouldn't be funny the second time, but it's still funny.
And now we need to cut that part, Brett. God.
It's not getting cut.
Is that the horn that people heard at Winterfell?
No, that is just my Stannis horn that I have taken to playing whenever Stannis is mentioned or appears on screen, because this is the Stannis podcast, y'all. It's gonna be great.
Hopefully, not if we keep
because Brett and Travis, in their infinite wisdom, on a Stannis episode, decided to bring in another person who really likes the one true king. So if you're a Stannis hater, I just want you to know a couple things. One, you're probably going to hate this episode. And if you're not convinced by the end of this episode to repent your treason, I just want you to know that I deeply, deeply appreciate your hate because it nourishes me. It provides me physical sustenance. So thank you for being awful and wrong. And that's the tone of the episode we're going to go with.
And Frank
I don't condone it.
Frank is a poor
Frank
college.
it.
Frank is a poor college student. He needs that sustenance. He needs something to feed off of to survive.
Normal people have ramen. I have, people hating me on social media. It's perfect.
And also ramen. I mean, it's cheap.
And also, it's cheap. All right, so Frank, welcome back to the podcast. When we had you on last, we kind of teased that there was going to be something coming again with the three of us. Obviously, this episode is that, but there's something you've been working on since that podcast, and we're going to link it in the show notes for everyone. We'll put it on our Twitter to let everyone see it. Obviously, you have a lot of folks that follow you, and it'll get out there. But talk a little bit about what you've been working on, because we're going to talk about some of that here today as we begin our discussion on Stannis Baratheon.
Yeah, so this essay is a comparison of Stannis to an ancient figure from antiquity being redundant. But so George has stated repeatedly that there are various historical figures that have influenced his portrayal of Stannis, and we're going to get into those. And for me, I chose a character that I'm pretty familiar with, but that George has never outright said has influenced Stannis, but there are a lot of parallels that I thought were too convenient to be a coincidence in some cases. And so I wanted to call attention to them and kind of work through the implications of that comparison. And so the comparison is called, Stannis Antiportus, which is a play on the phrase Hannibal Antiportus for the Latin phrase of Hannibal Barca in the Second Punic War and his achievements against the Roman society that so deeply scarred them that even to this point in Italian, that phrase is still used to say, oh, there's like a really awful client at the door, or calamity is coming very soon, because it was Hannibal achieved a string of victories against the Romans that no one person would ever equal. It would take entire societies to even come close to what Hannibal was able to do to the Romans. And so obviously that speaks to his military genius, but there's some other factors in Hannibal's life outside of the military, in his youth, in just his entire life, that I thought were very interesting to parallel with Stannis. And another aspect of that is that in the Enlightenment, and especially in the early Romantic period in England and France, a lot of writers kind of take up Hannibal's brilliant but ultimately doomed efforts against the might of Rome as a very tragic, heroic figure that they really kind of wanted to play up. And so it was, he appears in a lot of literature and a lot of art. His feat of crossing the Alps with an ancient military is something that doesn't actually get equaled until the 20th century. and we still don't even know the path that he used. So these are all kind of accomplishments that really stand out and kind of play into a lot of the things that Stannis does. And so I wanted to write that essay just to kind of, contribute again to the fandom instead of just being a parasite. And yeah, it should be done, but it is done, the first draft anyway, and will be in its final published form by the time this pod comes out, and it'll be posted on Reddit under my name there, Sir Donald Peasbury. But yeah, that's kind of what I've been working on, and I think it's got a lot of relevance to the discussion we're going to have here for Stannis and his role in A Game of Thrones, and ultimately his end game in The Winds of Winter and beyond.
All right, I think that sounds great. I think that the way you lay out his tactical genius, his war campaigns against the Romans, I think people are going to be very interested and very enlightened on some of the stuff that you point out. But like you said, there's also some personal details that we're going to talk about here in just a minute that seem to parallel with Stannis. So again, everyone, look for that essay. We'll link it. Keeping with those historical comparisons, like you said, Frank, George hasn't specifically said Hannibal was one of those figures that he drew upon. You've laid it out pretty well that his, again, military genius is something that we can look at and see Stannis parallels. But let's talk about specifically a person that George has cited as an influence on Stannis Baratheon, because he was asked this question. And so George was speaking at 92Y, and the question came from the audience. The moderator reads a little slip of paper and says, "Who are your influences for Stannis Baratheon? Is he based on anyone from history, literature, or politics?" I think it was a surprising answer, because George says that he's based on several different characters, but he was very much inspired by Tiberius Caesar, partly from history, and we're going to talk a little bit about Tiberius's historical information, but to a great extent, Tiberius Caesar as portrayed by George Baker in the series I, Claudius. And if you haven't seen I, Claudius out there, go watch it. It is Game of Thrones light, I would say. But it draws solely upon the political machinations of the Claudian dynasty and the Roman emperors, Tiberius, Caligula, Claudius, and all of the women around them. And it's a great series. It's very well done. But I want to just read some details here, and let's discuss Tiberius for a minute. Again, if you haven't watched it, watch it. As I went back and watched the series in preparation, and George Baker has this really big, brooding presence on screen, which obviously is sort of how Stannis is described. He's tall, he's lean, he obviously broods. He is a presence in any room that he is. There's no mistaking who Stannis Baratheon is, just like there's no mistaking Tiberius Caesar when he enters a room. Baker portrays him almost like he's constantly biting his tongue, like he's frustrated, he's clenching his jaw, he's while he's sitting there ruling Rome and playing their Game of Thrones. Again, like Stannis is famous for clenching his jaw and his fists and grinding his teeth and being frustrated with all of the machinations that are around him. This is an interesting thing, because George says Tiberius Caesar in I, Claudius is very important for the first 6 episodes. If I remember correctly, there are 7 or 8 episodes in total of the series. So that says to me, like A Game of Thrones, like A Song of Ice and Fire, Stannis is very important for what 80%. And you know, we're going to talk a little bit here in a minute about in-game. Even if he dies, even when he dies, you know, he's still going to be an important character because of what he does. But I think that's just interesting that George specifically pointed that out. Now to talk about the historical parallels of Tiberius himself, the actual man, not the fictional portrayal. Tiberius was one of the greatest Roman generals in history. He specifically campaigns in northern Germany, which obviously was the northern frontier of the Roman Empire. And he was famous for using pincer moves to envelop his foes, which we know both from the book and from the show that Stannis is fond of. And I think he even uses one at the Battle of Fair Isle to destroy the Ironborn fleet. And then this final point, and then I want you guys to jump in here. He had these great conquests across the known world, Tiberius did. But even with these victories, Pliny the Elder, famous Roman scholar and historian, remembers him as a dark, reclusive, somber ruler who was described as the gloomiest of men. That's a pretty, both historical and fictional, that's a pretty strong parallel to Stannis Baratheon, right?
Absolutely. I think you see that in Baker's performance of the character. And I've only watched that series once, and it was a while ago. And so, but again, that does come out on the screen. I think any brooding figure with military accomplishments in history is going to be a very good parallel to Stannis. And
so
but
Stannis and Jon Snow are alike, is what you're saying.
I don't know what military accomplishments Jon has other than, you know,
getting stabbed in the heart.
Well, I mean, he held the wall against some wildlings who had no way of getting around it. So, you know, kudos, Jon. You got Corn Halfhand killed. Anyway, but going back to Tiberius, I think there's some other influences that come about from this. You know, in early on in his life, he's on the verge of becoming the second most powerful man in the empire after the first emperor, Augustus. But then because he withdraws from all of politics and he actually goes to Rhodes, a very kind of remote area in the Roman Empire at the time. And the reason is that at the time, Augustus had adopted the sons of his second wife and seemed to be grooming them to take over the empire to take on the role of Principes, which is basically, you know, at the time was emperor, just wasn't called that.
Which, correct me if I'm wrong, that's a pretty common thing in the Roman Empire, that it's not usually their sons or their daughters that are tasked with basically inheriting the throne. They kind of adopt rulers, right? They adopt an heir.
Well,
is that right? I've always heard that.
Well, I mean, it is not a pure succession monarchy or primogeniture where the oldest son inherits, but it's important to note that at this time period that we're talking about, this is the very beginning of the Roman Empire with Augustus. And so there's not precedence. You almost have to think of it as George Washington as the president. And a lot of what he does has become ingrained not by law but in American society. And so too it was with practice with Octavian / Augustus, is that he is operating under the fiction that the Roman Empire that the Roman Republic at the time still existed. He had all the powers of the emperor. But he didn't call himself an emperor, and he actually pretended to ask the senators for their advice. He pretended that he was the first among equals, which is what Principes means. And so there's no like structure for who and how gets that role when you die, when Augustus dies. And at this point, Augustus is getting up in age. Go ahead, Brett.
It's kind of like, because What wasn't it like they wanted to make George Washington king after the Revolutionary War was won, and he was like, no. I'm sure it didn't go down like that, but something like that.
And what Frank is saying, like specifically with the terms of office of the presidency, there was nothing said in Constitution at the time that said he had to serve. You only serve 2 terms. Washington set that precedent, created that
and then
structure.
After FDR, and then when you get the amendment to codify that, and we're kind of getting off track, but the point is that Augustus kind of has the power to determine who succeeds him, and he ends up picking. It seems that he's picking these kids, and so Tiberius kind of goes like, well, if this is going to happen, I'm out, and goes to an island fortress, which is very relevant. And so ultimately those kids end up dying before they can inherit, at which point, Augustus and Tiberius kind of reconcile. And so then he comes back and then gets, kind of placed into that role. And then there's also, kind of anecdotally, there's stories about how him not very much enjoying the company of his wife. And so that's just an interesting parallel to Selyse, although in Stannis' case, it's Selyse because Stannis is just uncomfortable with women, where in Tiberius' case, his wife was just very promiscuous at the time. And so there are differences between Tiberius and Stannis that I think should be noted, just to, again, reiterate the point that George is not just pulling from history. He is kind of making his own mark on each character. And so, for example, Tiberius ultimately gets a triumph, which is kind of basically a giant parade in Rome that's used to recognize generals. That it actually was a sticking point for Caesar that he didn't get a triumph for his conquest in Gaul, and that was actually a huge sticking point with him in the Senate. And then the biggest difference between Tiberius and Stannis, I think, is the fact that Augustus is his adoptive father and his father figure, and Tiberius gets the recognition from that figure, in that Augustus confirms him as his son, confirms him as his successor, and gets the recognition he needs. Now, this doesn't satisfy Tiberius, and I think ultimately what Stannis wanted and would have satisfied him if Robert had ever given him the recognition that he wanted, and frankly, I think earned. But I personally think that if you're a teenager and you almost starve to death for your brother, that's worth a thank you and a pat on the back. Robert Baratheon apparently disagrees with this, and I'm not saying he's a piece of shit for not doing that to his younger brother who nearly starved to death, but I'll let our noble listeners draw their own conclusions.
Well, Robert's a piece of shit for many other reasons besides
absolutely
that. So whether or not he is for that. We could still draw the same conclusion.
Yeah, but again, and so Tiberius kind of gets that recognition, which is something that Stannis ultimately doesn't, and I don't think at any point will, because on the heels of his greatest triumph, and we'll talk about this later, on the heels of his greatest triumph at Winterfell, where he smashes the Frey and Bolton alliance and liberates the North to get them ready for the coming long night, he's still going to get abandoned, and it's just not going to matter, which is a very interesting parallel between him and Hannibal. But yeah, that's kind of the main things on Tiberius, is that there are a lot of parallels, but there are a few differences too.
Sure. And like you said, this is not a one-to-one. George is a student of history, and he's also a student of fantasy and fiction, and uses those best elements. But within history, a lot of people say real life is sometimes more complex and more colorful than even fiction can be. And so I think we've laid out a great case that Tiberius is both personal and tactical influence on Stannis Baratheon, and it's one that George specifically cites. So I want to move on to the next one here, because this one gets thrown around by the fandom a lot, both people who, again, love Stannis and people who hate Stannis, and that would be Agamemnon. I want to give some details here. We'll discuss him. I think people know what Agamemnon is famous for, but there's some interesting parallels here that perhaps George knew or used, though I think sometimes when he uses certain sigils or certain symbols, people then go back and find these pieces of information, and it fits in, and it just happens to fit in sometimes. But let's talk about him. So first of all, his name in Greek means very steadfast and unbowed. That's a big descriptor of Stannis. We know that he is steadfast in his convictions and in his mission. He famously will not bend. It's said that he'll break before he bends. We're going to talk a little bit about that. That may be more fiction than reality. But Agamemnon is also very famous because he sacrifices his daughter. He sacrifices his daughter before the Greeks sail for Troy. We obviously know in the show that Stannis sacrifices Shireen. I think we all agree that's probably going to happen in the books. I know there are some people who don't think that that's going to happen, but I think general consensus is that's going to happen. And then it gets a little gray, a little foggy on Agamemnon, where some people say he was willing to do the sacrifice. Other people say he was unwilling to do it. Again, something that may happen with Stannis's arc. It's also possible that his daughter was a willing or unwilling participant. Again, it's foggy there. But here's something really interesting that comes up in mythology as it relates to Agamemnon. He accidentally kills a deer in Artemis's grove. The goddess grows angry and uses the wind to thwart the fleet from sailing. In order to appease her, Agamemnon sacrifices his daughter, Iphigenia. Now, in some stories, Artemis interferes at that moment when she's being sacrificed and replaces her with a deer instead that is then sacrificed. Now, there's some interesting symbolism there, right? A stag, a deer, is the symbol for House Baratheon. The fact that the goddess Artemis uses the wind to thwart the fleet, we know, and obviously the wind isn't against Stannis and his army as they sail from Dragonstone north, but we know Melisandre sacrificed, what was it, one of the Florents to gain the wind, to make the fleet go faster. So I think that's just some interesting parallels. What do you all think about the comparison to Agamemnon that a lot of the fandom uses?
So, first thought that came to mind about the switching is Mance Rayder and the Lord of Bones. I'm drawing a blank on his
Rattleshirt.
name. Rattleshirt. Yeah.
We don't actually learn his true name, but yeah, that's a good comparison.
That is
good. So whether or not that's maybe more foreshadowing confirmed, or hey, this is a red herring and Shireen is definitely getting burned. I don't know. So
I mean, Stannis's personal sigil when he takes R'hllor to, kind of as his god at that point, when he alters his banners, is a stag on fire. And so you're, whether you think that there's plenty of symbolism that you can draw from that, whether that's Stannis gazing into the fire and seeing the crown, on his head burning and consuming him into ash, whether you think that is, Shireen being the, stag who is going to be burned, or whether it is the Agamemnon, kind of play where some versions have, Artemis intervening and substituting a deer for Agamemnon's daughter. That's kind of, there's a lot of symbolism that you can take from that. But I think the interesting one is the idea that, Shireen somehow escapes it. Ultimately, I think she won't, simply because of there's too much buildup for her to get away, and even if she does, I mean, the army of the dead is going to be right outside. So escaping.
I can't imagine her dragon dreams of her. What is that? Her being burnt alive or something like.
Yeah, the dragon's coming and eating her.
Or I can't imagine that being Daenerys or I mean, it could. I mean, if the undead dragon does come to pass, though, I mean, it could be that possibly that she's dreaming about. So there could be a big fake out with that. But I feel like it's already been done. I feel like, yeah, I don't know.
I think it's almost it's more a metaphor for her death, that she was surrounded by all of these statues of dragons and these gargoyles of dragons on Dragonstone, which she fears and dreams of. And so I think the fire in her mind, obviously fire is very associated with the Targaryens and dragons. I think in her mind it sort of eludes. I mean, she's got some Targaryen blood in her to begin with, so
dragon dreams.
Perhaps there's something more to the dream that it's kind of communicating to her that, hey, you're going to die by fire.
What a terrible dream!
It would be terrible.
I don't want any dream like that. But yeah, I mean that's probably true. I mean, in one of the Duncan Egg novellas, it was the third one, Bloodraven or Maynard Plum. If you don't believe he's Bloodraven, he's talking about like, oh yeah, Targaryens have dragon dreams, so it makes sense for it to manifest in a black fire from time to time. So, and Baratheons start off as bastards of Targaryen, so it makes sense that they have it too.
Yeah.
So.
All right. So that's Agamemnon. Again, some very interesting parallels. Another one that gets thrown around by the fandom, and I think everyone understands why it's used, is Macbeth. And first, we want to give a shout out to Shakespeare of Thrones. If you're not following Shakespeare of Thrones on Twitter, you're missing out.
And you're fucking wrong.
And you're right. And actually, they're right now doing I think they're basically not rewriting the story, but they're adapting the story into Shakespeare language, which is very interesting. So kudos to that. That's amazing. But Shakes has an essay, Stannis Baratheon, Macbeth Revisited. Now, in this essay, Shakes does a really amazing job of noting both the similarities and the differences. Because if you're flat out just saying, well, Macbeth is Stannis because Macbeth was a traitor and tried to take over the kingdom, then you don't know what the fuck you're talking about, right? So let's lay out some of the similarities and differences here. So first, Stannis is overly just and duty driven. Macbeth was greedy and ambitious. And I know there's a lot of people out there, and we're going to talk about ambition a little later. I know there's a lot of people out there who think Stannis is ambitious, and I just think it's completely the wrong take. But we want to be fair, because we try to be fair on this podcast, that Shakes also presents the similarities of these two men. And let's say this, that they're very basic similarities. Macbeth is a high lord and a highly competent commander who aspires to higher office. Okay. That sounds like Stannis, right?
Sounds like Littlefinger too. Sounds like a lot of lords.
Sounds like a lot of people.
Yeah.
Lady Macbeth urges her husband to consult the witches after hearing a prophecy.
Okay, that sounds like Stannis.
Sounds like Stannis. The witches help Macbeth with his quest for the throne.
Yeah.
Okay. Melisandre, sure. We don't think she's a witch. We're going to talk about her later. Okay, she is, but
I mean, she's like old school definition witch, but I mean, it's a pretty loose term. She's more like a religious zealot, though.
Sure.
With magical powers, which I guess is a witch.
That part.
Macbeth commits murder that escalates in moral revulsion. We'll talk about Ridley later, and that the murder was justified.
Well, it's not even that it's justified. If we're going with revulsion, the fact is that nobody cares. Nobody cares. That Renly, like Brienne, moves on. The only person who doesn't is Loras. But his version of not moving on is to like say that I'm not going to have sex with anyone else. Which again, to kind of crap on the show for a moment, they just Loras gets over Renly in like a minute. But anyway, continue.
He did kill some people before that, but then he was like, okay, it's over.
Well, and I think people also with the revulsion aspect to Macbeth's murder, they throw Shireen in there, and they throw in the fact that Stannis is willing to sacrifice the Florents or burn people at the wall. I think there's some justification in the fact that being burned alive would be fucking terrible, but it's also a method of punishment. It's a method of execution, just like swinging a sword and cutting off someone's head is. It might be one of the worst, but in his mind, it's a method, right?
It's like going to hell,
What?
you burn for eternity.
Right.
So
whoa.
It's a method of punishment, But there might be symbolism behind
true.
that, the burning. Because I mean the whole R'hllor thing, like the Seven reminds me of like Catholicism, but then when Melisandre comes in talking about like the one true God, like that just screams Christianity at me. And then it's the fire god, but I don't know, like, so the burning people that are wicked.
Let's save R'hllor and Melisandre and the religion for a question later.
Okay. Yeah.
So back
it just clicks with me. Yeah. So
sure. So back to Macbeth. A prophecy emboldens Macbeth to believe he can't die in battle. Sure, Azor Ahai, I think if Stannis believes that he is Azor Ahai, I mean, I don't really think that within that prophecy there's proof that that person can't die. And in fact, in one of Stannis's visions, he has a vision that the pursuit of the crown, the fact that he's wearing the crown, the fact that he's king and he has to take on this battle is going to consume him. I don't think he doesn't think, oh, I'm invincible. I think he thinks that I'm doomed. I'm going to die, but I have to do this because it's my duty.
What if he is Azor Ahai?
Well, we can talk about that later.
If wishing made it so.
Yeah. If wishing made it so, Frank's Twitter would have brought it into reality. All right. So let's talk about their motivations, because Shakes does a really good job of delineating their motivations. Stannis has a rightful claim to the throne. Macbeth does not. He literally usurps it. Stannis does not lie, and he speaks bluntly, honestly, plainly. Macbeth lies through and through. So Stannis has an ingrained sense of duty and justice. Obviously, Macbeth does not. Additionally, there's a famous tactic used by Macbeth's opponents where they cut trees and limbs to conceal their advance, which is obviously something Stannis and the Northern host do in their attack of Deepwood Motte. And then there's the blood on the hands. The fact that I think it's Lady Macbeth in that famous quote where she says, "Out spot, out damn you," and she's rubbing her hands trying to clean the blood from her hands in the play. And we know that when Stannis is relaying to Davos about the death of Renly, and he's talking about the fact that he was asleep, he was in his tent, he was in bed, and he wakes up to realize his hands were clean. And we can talk maybe a little bit later about what that means, but that's just sort of a little parallel there, because the blood on the hands is very important in conveying in Macbeth that they're responsible for what's happened. Stannis is looking at it and thinking, did I really do this?
Yeah, and there's some debate to be had on whether Stannis was aware of what exactly Melisandre was going to be doing, and there's going to be, I imagine, a great debate on that. As as we go through this, and there already is. But yeah, it ultimately comes to an issue of responsibility and how Macbeth is portrayed, and whether you kind of buy, like it's unquestionable there for Macbeth, but it is very much kind of more in debate for Stannis.
Mm-hmm. So a next one that people use quite frequently, and I don't think this is as clear as what some people think it is, but it's Richard III. And this is an interesting parallel because Richard is a younger brother, though he's not the youngest, or he is the youngest. Stannis is obviously not the youngest. But Richard is the younger brother of Edward and George, who becomes Edward IV. So let's just describe a little bit about those three characters. Edward, again, becoming Edward IV, is a warrior who takes the throne. He has many mistresses. He may have been poisoned. We know Robert wasn't poisoned, but he was, in a sense, given strong wine that inebriated him. Edward changes his will near his death, and he names Richard as Lord Protector. And now that's where Richard has a parallel somewhat to Ned. George, who we could compare to Renly, is the second brother. Again, Renly's the youngest. George, the death in Shakespeare's play of George is attributed to the machinations of Richard. Obviously, Renly's death is because of the machinations of Stannis. A soothsayer speaks into Richard's ears about his brother, and George's ghost later appears to haunt Richard. You could say that the soothsayer is Melisandre, and you could obviously say that George's ghost, Renly's ghost, is a parallel there. Now, let's specifically talk about Richard III here. Younger brother to a warrior king. That warrior king, Edward IV, married a beautiful blonde, Cersei Lannister. Richard goes on to declare his nephews as bastards. Stannis is obviously right in declaring his nephews as bastards, although Edward's children may have been bastards as well. We're not sure about that. Richard III becomes the last of the Plantagenet line. That could happen with Stannis. There's some Baratheons. There's a lot of dead Baratheons, although there's quite a few of Robert's bastards out there that may be elevated later on. But there's a big difference because Edward and Richard were very close, and we know that Robert and Stannis were not.
Yes. But they seem like they have, like, Ned and Stannis seem very similar, and just certain, they're not exactly similar, but they seem like they, for some reason Robert, attached himself to Ned, but then like shunned.
Well, I think that's where Richard embodies, or Ned embodies Richard III a lot.
Yeah.
I think you're right about that.
And then Davos, for Davos is I guess Davos is he's not like Robert at all, but
No.
He just I don't know, but yeah.
Frank, what do you? Oh, sorry.
Oh no, you're good. Good.
Frank, what do you think about the comparisons to Richard III?
Yeah, I think the family dynamic kind of skews this one just a little bit, just because of that relationship. Where I think for Stannis, the inability to ever get a good relationship with Robert is a core aspect of him. Like, Robert's dead. By the time we meet Stannis, Robert is dead, and even in the book 5, he's talking about, well, I'm not my brother, so we're gonna do it my way. And he's constantly, even Asha, who is just meeting him at that point and really has no reason to think of him other than to use him as a cudgel to beat over the head of Victarion about Fair Isle. she can see instantly that he's constantly in the shadow of Robert. So I think that family dynamic kind of skews it. Obviously, in terms of, what ends up happening with them, with the younger brother and everything else there, definitely kind of works. But it's, I think it's that family dynamic that I keep hooking up, because the relationship Stannis has with his brothers is so fundamental to who he is and ends up being and will be.
It's so weird that like I couldn't imagine having like siblings and not being close to them. So their relationship, like I get it it baffles me because I can understand how, I know this is a little off topic, but I can understand how Renly was so young. It's like, yeah, we don't really understand him. Like, and then I guess Robert got sent away, but I just don't get the. I mean, I get it with them, but I just don't get the distance. I feel like they would have made up or something. But I guess, I guess Robert was so like heartbroken after his rebellion that he just never really came around.
Yeah, I think
well, and their parents' death too.
Yeah, I think for me, in Stannis, and this is just as good for Stannis, the Win Proud episode. Like a lot of people point to Proudwing, the Goshawk that he has. That that's kind of the key to unlocking Stannis, and that he has these nurturing, protective impulses, but they're ultimately ground down by those around him and the culture around him. And so for me, the Wind Proud, which is the name of the ship his parents were on, which breaks up within sight of Storm's End, is kind of the key element to understanding Stannis. But in regards to his relationship with Robert, what we know about Robert is that he does not deal with things he doesn't like well. He just wants to close his eyes. He just wants to go away. He just wants to keep drinking. He just wants to keep on partying. He doesn't want to deal with those things. So to me, what that means to me, and we don't ever get like confirmation of this, this is just a supposition on my part, but for Robert, he can't see Stannis without thinking back to watching his parents die, and he can't get over that. And so that it's not the nail in the coffin of the relationship. That comes when Robert gives Storm's End to Renly. The nail in the coffin, it's a nail in the coffin in that Robert can't really look, because Robert doesn't have a problem with Stannis' personality, because Ned's kind of that way.
Yeah.
And so it's not that he has an inherent problem and wants everyone to be gregarious. It's that they have too much mutual trauma, and neither of them, and the culture they're in, doesn't really know how to process it.
Yeah. It's so weird, too, because traditionally the Targaryens get the crown prince inherited Dragonstone, but Robert gave that to Stannis as a punishment.
Well, I mean, I don't know. I mean, whether it's a punishment, like you have to believe. You have to believe Cersei in that case that it's a punishment. But regardless, whether or not it's a punishment, the fact is that Robert never took Stannis aside and said, "Look, the reason I'm giving it to you is because you're my heir, because I need someone who can hold on to the old Targaryen stronghold that probably has a lot of Targaryen loyalists still on it. And I can't give that to a kid because, and this kind of Robert never does that.
But Robert's not good at talking about his feelings.
Well, he doesn't even need to talk about his feelings. He just needs to explain to Stannis why he's getting that, and he never does that.
Well, and I think this will perfectly lead into a question a little later about political skills, both for Stannis and Robert, and we can get to that because I think it's an important discussion in the dynamic between the brothers.
Can I tack one more thing onto that real quick? Also, I think maybe another reason for Stannis being so mad about it is maybe Stannis is a little more like sentimental than he lets on. Like maybe he just wanted Dragonstone to, I mean, he watched his parents die, so Robert doesn't want anything to do with it. But maybe he wants his home back, Maybe he wanted that. He comes off.
I think you're right in that he's very nostalgic but I don't think it's nostalgic for Storm's End so much. I mean, I think he wanted it for its lands, its incomes, its greater troops. Maybe those were the reasons. But he repeatedly references the fact, and he's embittered by the fact that Robert never gives him any credit for all that he does for him, and he does do a considerable amount for him. But again, this is the family dynamic, and we can kind of continue that later.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Yeah.
All right. So just another quick comparison. Aurelion was an accomplished soldier and commander who becomes an emperor of Rome. He's known as a very strict administrator who hands out severe punishments to corrupt officials. We know that Stannis himself, we don't know that Aurelion, swings the sword himself, but we know that Stannis does. He's very strict. He will do it himself. He cuts off Davos's fingers at the knuckle for the crime of smuggling. He gelds soldiers who rape in his army. He can't stand that. He gelds them. So, and we know, can you imagine if he had taken King's Landing, the corrupt officials that he would have put their heads on a spike? God, that would have been
the only one I would have been sad orgasmic. The only one I would have been sad about is Tyrion, because he really didn't deserve it at that point.
Tyrion probably could have escaped in time, potentially.
I think he would have. Left. But
those
are
Varys. The costs of war.
Yeah, I think he would have left with Varys, though. There's no way he would have died.
Yeah, he probably would have. You're right.
Varys would have totally left.
I mean, at the end of the battle, Tyrion is basically infirm. So if they were gonna, if the Baratheons win, there's no escape for Tyrion.
That's true.
True. Yeah, he stepped out. Yeah.
So. And then, one final point about Aurelion. He tried to unify Rome under one faith, one empire mantra. In particular, worshiping the god Sol Invictus, which sort of has a parallel to R'hllor. Both in the fact that it's one single god, but R'hllor is associated with fire. Obviously, the sun is also associated with fire and light and all that. So, I want to turn. We talked earlier about Hannibal Barca. I want to turn it back over to you, Frank, to talk about some more of the parallels between Hannibal. And I know a lot of this information, this is a lot of information. We're going to talk a bit more about the battles themselves as we get into the discussion on what happens to Stannis in the Winds of Winter with the Battle of Ice and the taking of Winterfell.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of this is in my essay, and I don't want to kind of overburden our readers with these historical comparisons, but one that I really want to draw on for this episode is not so much an event so much as a characteristic of the two. And so for Hannibal, for those who don't know, Hannibal is from the city of Carthage, and this is a Phoenician city, which means that it was founded by the city of Tyre, which is actually in Syria, but it was colonized by them, eventually breaks away, becomes its own power in its own right. And Carthage, if it wasn't usurped by Rome's position in Mediterranean history, would likely be one of, if not the most influential civilizations in the world. They actually are the first in civilization to invent clear glass, at least in Western societies. There's independent discoveries out there, but in Western societies, they invent clear glass, and it becomes an enormously valuable commodity. They're amazing shipwrights. They're one of, if not the first civilization to sail around the Horn of Africa. And so that's kind of his background. And Hannibal is born in a time of great conflict between Rome and Carthage. But the key point that I want to talk about is that Hannibal himself is from North Africa. He campaigns before his fight with Rome. He campaigns in Spain, gets a ton of Spanish soldiers. Then when he marches on Rome, instead of going by sea or trying to go up through Sicily, which other Carthaginian generals in a previous war had tried and failed, he ultimately ends up going the other way and goes from Spain through southern France, through all the way to the Alps, and then through the Alps. And while he's doing this, he is repeatedly gathering mercenaries and tribesmen who had been beaten by Rome and saying, come join my army, let's go defeat the Romans. He does that. He goes into Italy, he gains enormous victories, and then he gets actually Italian allies of Rome to flip, and they provide him with soldiers. So just in that, you have mercenaries of all kinds from all over the Mediterranean, and some even from Greece. So you have mercenaries, you have tribesmen from all over the Mediterranean, you have Italians, and then you have his African troops. And so this is a very multicultural band of his, and he campaigns in Italy for more than a decade as an army just operating in enemy territory, which is a feat almost completely without parallel in human history. But the multicultural aspect of his forces is very important because he has no desertions. Even the Romans, who had a tendency to kind of play up the faults and failures, not so much the faults and failures, but they like to kind of needle their opponents and say, yeah, you're a great general, and so we're even better by beating you, but here's all your little faults that we like to play on. But even they say that no one attempted to desert from this army, which talks about the personal charisma of Hannibal. With Stannis, the parallel that I make is that he has his men from Dragonstone and from around the kind of the southern part, kind of near the Crown lands, but especially the Storm lands that he gets to come over from Renly. And so while Stannis does have desertions at the Battle of the Blackwater, eventually he sails north, and he has troops from the Stormlands, troops from Dragonstone. Then he goes north, and he gets the Night's Watchmen, some of the Night's Watchmen to help him at the Battle of the Wall. Then he gets the Northern Tribesmen, and he's taking the Northern Tribesmen, and he's about to destroy the Boltons. And he's doing this, and he's holding together a multifaceted force where even, again, outsiders comment on the fact that he is maneuvering and knows these troops so well. And the example that I like to use is that in the Theon 1 sample chapter, you have his knights coming in to tell him that they want Theon dead, and Stannis cuts him off and says, I know what they want. They want him dead. Like he's either talking to his lords and knows what they want and can anticipate what they want, which shows him doing the diplomacy that we, so often get told he can't do. But he does it in a way that he intuitively can tell in what situation they want. And so it speaks to a personal charisma that the common soldier really follows Stannis. And so that's kind of a comparison that I think is worth making, in that it's not just personal charisma amongst soldiers that that you've grown up with your entire life. It's gaining those troops. And Hannibal's ability to get those kind of, maybe not, I don't want to say uncivilized, but not as static peoples as the Romans to join up with him very much parallels Stannis's recruitment of the hill tribes, which again, we all wish we had on the page. Right. But that's kind of the main parallel that I want to do with Hannibal. And obviously, my essay kind of goes into a little bit more about their upbringing, their victories, their ultimate fate. But that's kind of the aspect I wanted to point out for here. And we'll talk about like a couple of specific victories of Stannis here later in the essay. But that's kind of just in brief what I wanted to mention about Stannis and Hannibal.
Yeah, there's one interesting quote that I just want to point out to the listeners that's attributed to Hannibal. And it's, I will either find a way or make one. That really reminds me of two quotes. One from the sample chapter that you point out. It's not a word for word or a one-to-one comparison, but when Theon is basically mocking Stannis, that you don't have the high ground here. You don't have anything, any type of defense. And Stannis just simply says, yet. There's something turning in his mind. He's got a plan. And I really I agree with you. I love that sample chapter. Yes. Not only because you get so much of Stannis and Theon, etc., but I also just like the inner look of like a battlefield commander, his command tent. I know he's in a tower, but people coming and going. He's looking at documents. He's making plans. He's preparing. I just like that inside look. But then there's another quote from Stannis where he says that, and I think he's saying it to the men when he's saying, well, yes, I know what Robert would do.
Yes, yeah.
But he says, but we will march and we will free Winterfell or die in the attempt. Basically, he's, like we said earlier, he's relentless. He's steadfast. He's going to keep going And we obviously want him to free Winterfell, but those are just two quotes that kind of remind me of that Hannibal quote.
I also, about the high ground thing. If there's one thing to learn from Star Wars Episode 3 is if you have the high ground,
oh God,
you've won.
Yes, that's true. That's true.
Yeah.
Just a couple
how
other
powerful you are.
Right. Just a couple other things I want to point out for the listeners in just some comparisons to Hannibal. His father dies by drowning. Again, Stefan Baratheon dies on the Windproud, drowning in the site of Storm's End. Barca means shining or lightning, which I just kind of think is interesting in comparison to the Baratheons ruling Storm's End, where we know there's a ton of storms that hit that area. And there's even that really great artist's interpretation in the World of Ice and Fire of Storm's End with these lightning bolts in the background. Hannibal studied his opponent's strengths and weaknesses. And correct me if I'm wrong, but I seem to remember that it's said that Stannis does the same thing. He knows the power of each house and region very well. Did I just create that, or am I?
No. It's said that Stannis knows the strength of every, like how many swords and spears that each house is able to, raise in any moment.
Yeah, and I also feel like it's obvious, like all these houses like underestimate him and just think he's like a lot more stupid than he actually is. They just think he's just like, like what Donald Noy said about him is completely wrong.
I don't think they think he's stupid.
Well, they think he's like Donald Noy said. Like, right. He's kind of like
he's unable to adapt or change.
Yeah, and that's a lot. Like, yeah, he's unrelenting and just very pushy about his ways, but he kind of knows how to manipulate more than people think.
Yeah,
I think in terms of like his reputation, at the end of book 1, Tywin says outright that he's more afraid of Stannis than he is of all the others combined. Mm-hmm. So I think he does have a very fearsome reputation. Varys is terrified of him. Littlefinger almost gives his game away solely because he wants to prevent Ned from figuring out, from basically helping Stannis get the Iron Throne. Because if that happens, the game's over for him. And so I don't think that we're meant to think that he has a bad reputation in the story. It's just that there's real questions about whether he has the flexibility to ultimately maneuver that, and ultimately he shows that he does.
And it's kind of like it's kind of like Stannis, like or not Stannis. Sorry, it's kind of like Tywin. Everyone thinks Tywin's a lot, more clever and flexible than he really is, and he's really not. Like, he has to resort to, sending letters to the Freys to murder Robb Stark under, a peace agreement to end the war, where Stannis would never do that. Like, you don't think he would?
The Red Wedding, maybe not, but he does use assassins. Like, we can argue about whether or not he knew about Renly. It's inarguable that he knew about Courtney Penrose. Right. Like, he gives that order. He's in full awareness.
They didn't eat the bread or salt,
Yeah, I know, exactly. but there's a very fine line between assassinations and the Red Wedding. The Red Wedding violates guest right.
But so
it also
to answer your question, or sorry, go ahead, Travis.
I was also going to say I think the scale of the Red Wedding, Stannis would not, unless it was like the last resort. But as Tywin says,
yes, that's what I was going to say.
What's a few hundred dead people at a dinner?
But it
Frank,
was like
you eloquently point out it wasn't just a few hundred; it was a few thousand. both inside the castle and outside the castle. Stannis might take out Robb, like he took out Renly, but he's not going to butcher a bunch of people.
Yeah, he only took
like
out
that.
He only took out Renly, and he only took out Penrose, and that ended it. Like, he did what he had to do. So,
what do you think, Frank?
I don't know. It's definitely.
He's going to end. He's going to. It depends on the level of threat.
Sure.
In that Stannis is going to ultimately burn his daughter alive in order to end an apocalyptic threat. But we also need to factor in that Tywin orders the Red Wedding because his pride's wounded, and that Robb Stark smacked him around for however for like 3 battles, and even longer by being in the field and campaigning in the Westerlands. So I think that's kind of the important point to keep in mind with that.
And another thing to tack onto that, I like how even Jaime learned from losing from Robb. He's like, yep, I'm going to set out, sentries. And when he goes back out there, like, he's like, I'm not having that ever happen to me again. I'm taking all the safety precautions I can.
Yeah.
And, yeah.
So I know we want to get into some specific battles that could inform what's going to happen in the Winds of Winter and beyond, but just a couple more points on Hannibal. Hannibal goes on to. You're
going to take out all the air out of my.
Sorry.
No, it's fine.
Remember, this podcast. Well, never mind.
Can always be edited.
It can always be edited.
Yeah, for your guys' benefit.
For our benefit.
For yours too. Come on.
Hannibal serves at Bithynia, where he wins an outstanding naval victory against is it Pergamon Kingdom? Pergamon Kingdom. Now, they're a well-known, very skilled naval force. They have a strong navy. That obviously reflects the fact that Stannis was able to defeat the Ironborn at sea, which I think is a great accomplishment. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that later and why we think it could have been a really big accomplishment for him. Just to jump back real quick to Hannibal is at the gates, the famous line that strikes fear into the hearts of the Romans and even the Italians to a degree today. There's a very famous section in A Ghost in Winterfell from A Dance with Dragons, the Theon chapter. But this is when Theon hears the horn. He hears the horn, he hears the drums, and it's very interesting because, first of all, George kind of betrays the POV structure here and kind of steps out of that the mind of Theon, and kind of, it almost seems like the camera sort of jumps around the castle to someone waking up in a bed, someone on the wall gripping their spear, looking off into the distance, people whispering to each other, Stannis is here, Stannis has come, Stannis, and that's what we were making the point earlier, and Frank so eloquently pointed out that this cry scares the Romans to death. And we get that in this chapter, A Ghost in Winterfell, where the people inside the walls of Winterfell are frightened because they think, oh, here it is. He's finally come. And we have a battle on our hands.
Isn't that one of the Umbers outside too? Outside the walls making noise?
Is it Moors, I think?
I can't.
It might not be.
I don't know. There's one on one side, one on the other, but they probably all remember, or the North remembers. So,
yeah. All right. So I want to jump right into the Battle of Ice and the taking of Winterfell. And Frank, I want you to talk about it in the terms of a very famous battle that Hannibal and the Romans fought in, and how it could parallel what happens in the Winds of Winter.
Yeah, so Hannibal's abilities very much parallel any good commanders, but especially Stannis's in their use of terrain. So the battle I'm going to refer to is the Battle of Lake Trasimene. And if you already know this battle, congrats, you're a nerd. But for those who don't know, basically what happens is Stannis crosses the Alps. The Romans have a complete freak out because no one would expect this, because how could you? Because no one does this. So they send an army up to Hannibal, and he beats the crap out of them at the Battle of the River Trebia. So then he's operating in Roman territory in the interior. It'd be like if an army suddenly appeared in the middle of Kansas and had defeated an American army and then was going around just pillaging wherever they wanted. That was the equivalent for the Romans to have an army cross the Alps and then start messing around in the hinterlands. So they send two armies under what are the Roman office called consuls, and there's two of them, but they're basically the presidents of the Romans. There's obviously a lot of differences, but these are the two top military officials. And so the two armies kind of split, which is the normal Roman doctrine. And then there is a commander of the Roman legions who's just watching Hannibal pillage it and decides, I'm not dealing with this anymore. I'm going to go after Hannibal. And all of his advisors, counsel him to be cautious, to not go after Hannibal until they send out scouts. He's like, no, I'm sending the entire army after him. He's right there. The reason he thinks he's right there is because Hannibal had camped by the side of a lake, Lake Trasimene, where the battle gets its name, and then there's kind of a defilade or a soft sloping ridge on the side of a road that runs right along the lake. And so at the end of the road so if you're picturing this from the west, the Romans are marching towards the east, and Hannibal has set up campfires, on the eastern end, basically as bait for the Romans to come off. And so the Roman commander just marches along this coast road, and when the entire Roman army is along the coast road on the side of the lake, basically the entirety of Hannibal's army comes crashing down right into the sides of them. And many of the Romans simply drown because they have nowhere else to go, because they're cut off from both ends of the road. They're cut off from, going uphill into the forces, which is where Hannibal's forces are coming from, and a lot of them drown. And so this parallels, a very interesting theory that was made by a gentleman of the name of Canute. I think I'm pronouncing that correctly.
It's can't use.
Excuse me. Can't use. And so it's called the night lamp theory, and it's basically the theory based on, some information we get from Theon 1 about how Stannis is ultimately going to defeat the Boltons and Freys. And I'll let you kind of, talk us through that.
Sure. So we know that Winds is going to open with two major engagements. In fact, they were two major battles that George had hoped to end A Dance with Dragons with. So first is commonly referred to as the Battle of Ice, the one we're talking about here in the north. Stannis versus the Freys and Boltons in Manderleys, which we think are obviously going to be very important to the conclusion of the battle, and the Battle of Fire, the Battle of Meereen. The other engagements that we're going to see in the Winds of Winter are the sacking of Old Town, commonly referred to as the Battle of Blood, and then the Siege of Storm's End, which I'm actually pretty excited about. I think that's going to be an interesting battle.
Yes.
Sometimes people call it the Battle of Mud because there's so much rain right now in the Stormlands, and that could parallel the Battle of Agincourt, where the English defeated the French. So anyways, within the first quarter or 1/3 of Winds, we're going to have these huge conflicts happening. But anyways, the Battle of Ice, Stannis's victory, why people think it's going to happen, as Frank has discussed with the Battle of Lake Trasimene, he's going to draw the Freys in. He's going to draw them in and use the natural terrain to surround them, envelop them, crush them. The night lamp theory, as Frank has pointed out, is the fact that the light on the top of the watchtower at the Crofters Village is commonly referred to as the beacon fire. The beacon fire, again, a beacon draws something. It points you in a certain direction. Now, that could obviously be the fire that's used, or Stannis could switch them, right? He could switch to the weirwood tree that's on the island in the middle of the lake. And there's precedent in Stannis' story arc for this, because if you remember back to Davos traveling through the Three Sisters on his way to White Harbor, he encounters House Burrell. And House Burrell is responsible for having these signal fires along the Three Sisters, so people know, just like a lighthouse, so ships know where port is. And House Burrell and I think some pirates at the time that Stannis was master of ships were switching the lights, switching the signal fires, and basically driving these ships onto rocks and aground, and then looting them. Would love to see this. Stannis sends a fleet from King's Landing to Sisterton and basically says, "Stop this! I'm hanging everyone. Don't make me come there. Don't make me come back myself." And the Burrells still remember that. So again, the beacon fire atop the watchtower at the Crofters Village could be switched to the weirwood tree, which would then draw the Freys and the Boltons onto the ice. Now, this is where the Manderleys and the Northern clans come into play, because, like Frank said, Hannibal's forces rush, pushing the Romans into the lake. We know that the Northern clans have these bear claw shoes that they can easily use to travel over snow and ice and everything. That would give them the ability to really push the Freys and the Boltons onto the ice or into the water, and then just be there to cut them down. And we know that the Manderleys are in the rear. They are bringing up the rear of the forces that are moving toward Stannis. And then finally, there's one other famous battle in history that people have used to describe what's happening or what could happen with the Battle of Ice, and it's called the Battle on the Ice. It's there were these Northern Crusaders, the Teutonic Knights, who stood against and I'm sure I'm going to mispronounce this, Novgorod. Is that how you would pronounce that?
Novgorod
Republic, which was led by Prince Alexander Nevsky. Now, it's important to note that in history, this may have not really happened. It could have been fictionalized propaganda by the Soviet director Sergei Eisenstein. However, because that was done in his film. However, this battle happened, and basically what they were doing is they were fighting on the ice, and people were falling through. So right there are 4 or 5 different things that George could use to push together to make this battle. I think there's a lot of concrete evidence in the narrative that something like this is going to happen and that Stannis is going to prevail at the Battle of Ice.
Yeah, I think that, and specifically with the night lamp theory, is that Stannis, there's foreshadowing for this in a lot of ways, but most importantly, in that chapter where Davos is talking with Lord Burrell, and it specifically references that Stannis himself is there. So if Stannis pulls the move that we think they're going to do, and again, I really do recommend Cantus's the essay on this. He's got a 5-minute version if you don't want to plug through this. But again, if you're not willing to plug through, really detailed, kind of minute things, why are you listening to this podcast? But he's also, so the full essay really does go into all of this foreshadowing. But again, the biggest piece of foreshadowing is that Stannis himself goes to Sisterton and says, stop messing with your beacon fire to lead ships astray. So this shows that Stannis himself has personal knowledge that this is going on. And originally the Battle of Ice and Battle of Fire were supposed to be at the end of A Dance with Dragons, but George ultimately cut them. So that's very important that we get this foreshadowing at the very beginning in Davos 1, and then at the end is where you would get the payoff of that foreshadowing. Because of the publishing and everything else, you get it pushed back to the Winds of Winter. But the important thing is that George is not bringing this out of the blue. We have a lot of evidence. And then to go back to my Hannibal comparison, Hannibal specifically tells his soldiers to light the fires a certain distance away to convince the Romans that they're further away than they actually are. And so when the Romans are marching towards these fires, they think they're in a column, a marching column, which is how you would march, which only exposes them more. If the fires had been closer where the Carthaginians actually were, the Romans would have deployed in kind of a battle formation, which would have been much harder for the Carthaginians to attack. So and so by altering the light signal, the Freys are going to blunder into the ice, but they're also not going to be expecting to blunder into the ice. And maybe the beacon fire is set further away, so they're not even in battle formation once the ice starts to crack. And so they're kind of in even more messed up position.
Yeah. And they're not even familiar with that terrain either. So
no, they're going to be working off the map. And again, this goes back to the foreshadowing. But in Theon 1, and if you don't read the sample chapters for Winds of Winter, you stop listening now. But there you have the Maester that Stannis brings before him, asks him what he sent to Winterfell, and the Maester just says a map. And so, exactly.
After he pisses himself.
Well, you'd piss yourself too if you realized that Stannis figured out that you'd betrayed him. So that's the foreshadowing that the Freys think they know where Stannis is, and so they're going to be using that map. And then they're going to try and be like, okay, so on the map here is Stannis's camp. There's the beacon fire. Let's head to the beacon fire, and then they're going to end up blundering into those double lakes and going to a watery grave, which they deserve because they're all Freys. And,
right.
Well, they're just Frey men. They're not Frey. They're not a part of the.
They're Frey men. That means they participated in the Red Wedding.
Yep. Fuck them.
Oh man.
I hope that whole fucking house is extinguished by the end.
The house is fine. I'm just talking about the poor people.
All of them, everyone.
The poor people they round up.
All right. Yeah. And I think it's just going to be it's going to be epic. It's going to be amazing to read that when it does happen. There's also
and this might be the first battle that we get via bird's eye view. Although we might get both battles via bird's eye view. If Danny probably doesn't come back in time for the Battle of Fire, so we won't get that battle at a bird's eye view. But if Bran,
there might be a few
seeing that battle, he might be the one to give us that perspective of it. Which leads into our next topic and the liberation of Winterfell.
The liberation of Winterfell.
Yes.
All right.
How do you think that battle is going to play out? Because I feel like there's going to be another kind of like fake out where something happens and either you get the bird's eye view and Bran just sees a bunch of people and there's probably a storm through the crow and he can't see properly, and then maybe it switches to Asha or something where it picks up with what happens.
Well, I'm very interested in to see how the Manderleys make out. Some people have speculated that the Freys will be collapsing into the ice and someone will be on the shore and the Manderleys will charge and push them in. There's some concern that the Manderleys get caught up in this, even though they're planning on betraying the Freys, but they get they land in that another one of the lakes themselves. So it's kind of how dark is George going to get? It's the Winds of Winter, so things could get pretty dark where the Manderleys are like, no, we're here to help you, and Stannis is like, nice trick, not falling for that again, and kills them all.
I could totally see that happening too.
Yeah. I think some portion of the Manderley strength has to survive because they're going to end up supporting Rickon when he shows up, and so but that goes way beyond where we're talking about. But
I think that Manderleys will purposely. Now, potentially some of them could die. Some of them could get into the battle and die. But
I think so.
Wyman probably purposely said, hey, keep a distance, keep behind. see what happens and go from there. All right, so we've discussed the historical and fictional influences on Stannis Baratheon as a character that we think George has used. And we've illustrated how, especially Hannibal Barca, his tactics may be what George uses to allow Stannis to win the Battle of Ice. Now, let's talk about what happens after the Battle of Ice, specifically with something Frank says so well, the liberation of Winterfell. How does Stannis and his allies take Winterfell? So, Frank, you want to kick us off with some of your thoughts, and then we'll kind of wrap up this podcast by talking about more how we think it will play out individually, but then maybe collectively come to an opinion on that.
Yeah, so I think the taking of Winterfell, I don't think the Battle of Ice was meant. The Battle of Ice is meant to go into the end of Dance with Dragons. George R. R. Martin said that at first he was going to separate out a Feast for Crows, and a Dance with Dragons, but then when he was writing just a Dance with Dragons, he was going to have a Battle of Ice and Battle of Fire at the end, which would have been a very climactic ending. But even then, he still couldn't, because it was going to be a bunch more POVs and probably like at least another 12 chapters combined between the two battles. So now the decision was made to have it start off no one's winner. But the reason I mention that is because towards A Dance with Dragons is really where you start to see the interweaving of the magical and the secular stuff. And obviously that's prevalent throughout A Song of Ice and Fire, but now where it's really coming into play is how it's so much more overt, where the magic used to be in the shadows, where literally the shadows with Mel's assassins, with it kind of being off the main stage with Dany over in Essos. But now there's going to be a huge battle kind of described by this effect. And so what you're going to have, in my opinion, is you're going to have a secular element to that, in that Stannis is going to do some subterfuge. He's going to get he's going to win the Battle of Ice through the means we've kind of talked about. And then he's going to do a standard subterfuge play, having his men put on the uniforms of defeated Freys, and then he's also going to use any Manderleys who survive, and then he's also going to use the Karstarks, who I think he's going to have, and be still my heart, but the idea of Stannis doing a rousing speech to the Karstark men after he's imprisoned their lords, and says, you can fight for me. This is, you're part of the North, and I know you guys don't like the Starks, but there's a way to regain your honor here, or however George ends up writing it. I think it'll be great, obviously, and it'll be or maybe we don't get that. Maybe that's just fan casting on my part. But but regardless, I think you're going to see Karstark uniforms, Manderley uniforms, and then that, because Ramsay has been misinformed. And as Stephen Atwell has written, there's no way for a feudal medieval battle to go for 7 days. And Ramsay, because he's an idiot and has never been near an actual big battle other than the sacking of Winterfell, and that really doesn't count, wouldn't know that. And so he writes that letter to Jon in the pink letter, and so he's been misinformed about, like, Stannis is dead. And I think that's going to come from them. So that's kind of the secular element. And then the magical element's going to be that when Bran goes, and I'm stealing this from poor Quentin Emmett Booth. I do that a lot, as you guys see in this podcast. But because he's got really great thoughts on this, but his argument is that when they go, and I there's been other people who have pointed to this, that when Bran and Bloodraven are already warging into ravens that are in Stannis' presence while he's telling them to shut up, which is hilarious,
right?
On so many levels. So then Stannis is going to go to lop off Theon's head, but then he's going to look at and see Bran's face there, and you're going to get a magical intervention. And I think what's going to happen is that there's going to be a pact made. It's spare Theon for a variety of purposes. Bran, because he's just a nice kid. Bloodraven, because he wants to use Theon against Euron. And in exchange, we will help you take Winterfell. And the reason I say that, and there's a lot of setup for this, is that Bran knows Winterfell better than anyone. And so there's a passage here from from Bran 2 all the way back in Game of Thrones, where he's talking about his climbing and how he knows the castle better than anyone. And he says, quote, climbing taught him Winterfell's secrets too. The builders had not even leveled the earth. There were hills and valleys behind the walls of Winterfell. There was a covered bridge that went from the 4th floor of the bell tower across to the 2nd floor of the rookery. Bran knew about that. And he knew you could get inside the inner wall by the south gate, climb 3 floors, run all the way around Winterfell through a narrow tunnel in the stone, and then come out on ground level at the north gate with 100 feet of wall looming over you. Even Master Lewin didn't know that. Bran was convinced. So if you flip those directions, you have a way to get inside. And so I think what's going to end up happening is that you've got Stannis's men in fake uniforms, or their actual uniforms, but they've flipped loyalties, going to Winterfell, being ready, and then the signal will be when Stannis and a couple of handpicked men, probably Richard Thorpe, one of his better knights, and his other knights, infiltrating Winterfell, and then at the signal you get a big kind of climactic scene flip where, oh wait, Stannis is alive, he's inside the castle, and Ramsay, you are utterly and completely fucked. So I think that'll be a nice interweaving of the plots, and that's how Stannis will ultimately liberate Winterfell.
Love it.
Yeah. Yep.
Brett, you have anything different?
Not really. I mean, this goes with like everything I've kind of thought. I've kind of thought, Ramsay's always written the red letter, but he was misinformed somehow, and he's actually not trying to play a trick. This is just what he believes that has happened, and like this just. I mean,
and parts of the pink letter are true.
Yeah.
I'd say that your point about the 7 days of battle, I think, is really interesting, because it's almost like people were like, well, it took us 3 days to get here, and we fought, and let's pretend we fought 1 day, and then it took us 3 days to get back. So let's just tell Ramsay it's 7 days, and he's a dumbass, and he's not gonna think that through. He's just gonna be so excited that they defeated Stannis that he doesn't care. He doesn't think about the details.
Let Ramsay's inevitable grisly end be a lesson to you to not buy into confirmation bias. Ramsay wants to believe that Stannis is dead, so he doesn't look at all the evidence.
Right.
It's like, wait, why are none of the Frey Lords alive?
Well,
these are all people I've never seen before.
Right, and it's possible by then Roose is dead, and he has no one behind him, saying, whoa, wait a minute, let's check this evidence, let's check these facts out.
Go ahead, Brett.
I do kind of believe he is going to kill Roose somehow too. That way, that kind of eliminates Roose from catching on to anything suspicious. And then you have Ramsay in charge, and he doesn't know. There's just certain things he's not going to catch, which will help this whole plot go down.
Yeah, Martin's a big fan of blind spots, as several in the commentary have pointed out, that Ramsay is Roose's blind spot, but then it'll be a very interesting twist if Ramsay's blind spot is the fact that he doesn't have Roose to tell him, this is not right. This doesn't add up.
Right.
And so that's ultimately how he goes down. And I think obviously Theon will be involved in that.
So I like your term there that you use, Frank, blind spots, and I think you're exactly right of what Stannis is going to do, because I think learning from the Battle of the Blackwater, he's now going to look intricately, and that's why he's sitting there at that tower, going through those plans, talking to all the men in his camp, understanding what they want, what they don't want to happen, and trying to come up with a plan that everyone can get behind to move forward. I think you're right. The Manderleys, whether they completely turn or they do so after the battle, or while the battle is going on, the Battle of Ice, and then they use the Frey armor to cloak some of Stannis' troops in there. Stannis and a strike force go off and enter, and there may even be some troops left somewhere in Wolf's Wood, that the gates are open to let them in. I just don't think Stannis is going to take any chance on this. He's going to have people inside the castle. He's going to
he might not
in
even
the castle, and then he's going to have a force outside to say, if all this goes wrong, I still need some of my army out there hiding, ready to come in.
Yeah, and I mean, Stannis like popping up in the middle of Winterfell before killing Ramsay. Again, that's probably fan casting on my part. Stannis' reputation is that he's kind of he's more of a commander than a warrior, and that he's always behind the battlefield observing it, which is usually the best place for a commander. It's kind of there's a ton of articles like talking about like the Eastern versus Western perspectives on command, where a great example is Subatai, who was Genghis Khan's greatest general, and he actually became literally kind of like Wyman Mannerly, too fat to sit a horse. And the Mongols, and where in Western society that would have shamed any commander to the point that he wouldn't have been able to be a military commander. The Mongols were like, well, this is the best guy we have, so literally just load him in a cart and have him tell us where to go. So interesting little tidbit of history for you guys. And so for Stannis, I think it's more likely, despite my fan casting of, Stannis popping up in the middle of Winterfell going, surprise, motherfuckers. It's more of Stannis, like his men, opening the gates, him riding through with all of his men, having Ramsay flung down in front of him, and then doling out the king's justice.
Great. I want the fan casting to happen. I want him to just,
if wishing made it so.
Pop up, this like 6 foot tall guy just pops up out of nowhere, and they're like, "Oh shit!"
Well, we've kind of seen that before too, like with his his shadow killing Renly. He kind of like popped up, but it'd be kind of cool since he is in the north to do the kind of your fan casting thing.
Right.
That would be cool, like a little change that he would normally do. But yeah, I think it's probably going to play out. The plan's going to go down, and then he's going to ride through the front gates.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And what I like so much about this is, Theon's blind spot in, and I don't know if you could term it a blind spot, but in A Clash of Kings, he was tricked by Ramsay as Reek, and Ramsay's soldiers. Now the same is going to potentially be true for Ramsay and those inside Winterfell, that they're going to get duped. And I think it's a bit of narrative justice, as I think you referenced poor Quentin earlier, something about, he said that on a recent podcast of Nauticast that there has to be some kind of equilibrium coming back. That's what we search for, and I really want Ramsay to get fucked over this way, because he's such a fucking terrible, terrible fucking person, and I hate him so much. Thank you.
That's all right. That's all right. People think you do.
Right. All right, so let's actually wrap up the podcast with talking about, because this is one thing that just I can't wrap my head around, and I think part of it is because of the show, how Ramsay ended in the show, and how he and Jon Snow fought it out, and his fall was eventually that. I don't know what happens. Like, I do think that Ramsay is set up to kill Roose and Fat Walda and a bunch of their supporters inside Winterfell and take control. I got to be honest. I mean, I totally agree with you. It's hard for me somehow to see the scenario of, and again, it might just be the show clouding my judgment, of Ramsay going down like that. But talk a little bit why you think that's the case, Frank.
Well, so there's a ton of foreshadowing that Ramsay's dogs are going to play a part, and I think I think Jon, as we talked about, Jon's storyline kind of got Stannis's liberation of Winterfell for a variety of reasons, like, and I get it, like, as we talked about, the time constraints are why you had to do that. They didn't mean you had to execute it so poorly, but so Stannis cannot, so Ramsay's not, he's a lesser villain. And it's
Yes.
hard. It's hard for us to conceive of Ramsay as a lesser villain, given
Yes.
everything he's done in the books and everything he's done in the show. But you have literal magical ice Nazi demons coming for the world, so that makes him a lesser villain. And to be perfectly honest, Euron is going to make Ramsay look like a lesser villain by the door. The fact that George can write someone like Ramsay and be like, "Yeah, I can beat that. I can beat that," is a little disconcerting, but. So Ramsay's going to end, and the dogs are going to play a key part in that, because that's the cosmic justice that George is a big fan of when he does dole it out. And obviously his point is sometimes bad people don't always get what they deserve, but a lot of times they do. And so the idea, and there was kind of a long Twitter thread a while back where we discussed how this is exactly going to go down. My personal favorite theory is that we will see Ramsay's end through Theon's perspective. And so Theon will tell Stannis, what the dogs are named for. And then, Theon or Richard Thorpe or Stannis himself or someone is going to push, Ramsay into the kennels, and they're going to lock the gate, and Theon's going to have the keys. And then they're going to describe in really brutal detail what's happening to Ramsay. And I think Ramsay's going to call out to Theon to save him. And like the very last part of the chapter will be Theon going, for a moment, he thought about opening the gate, but then he remembered his real name. And obviously George's writing is better than me doing this off the cuff. but the end of the chapter,
Still,
but the end of the chapter is going to be like Theon thinking for a split second to open up the gates and go get Ramsay, rejecting that, and then the end of the chapter is him smiling with his ruined teeth. And I think that's going to be the kind of just fist pump, great moment that maybe George undercuts with just the sheer nauseating gore of the moment. But at the same time, for some people, that'll do it and it'll be nauseating. For me, it'll be like, well, you got what you deserve.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
And I love that, because I think that's one thing that, and we're not going to talk about the show here to a great extent, but that's one thing that I thought that they really not failed with Theon's arc post Winterfell. But it would make so much sense for Theon to be the one that in some way gets that retribution back on Ramsay. So I think that makes a lot of sense that he would be one of the key people, not only to get them into Winterfell, but also to make sure justice is dispensed for Ramsay and his crimes.
Yeah, and I think, Sansa obviously in the show deserves that role just as much as Theon does in the books. And I did like that moments for them, and I think what the show's done really well. I've kind of crapped on the show a lot this episode, so I want to get them props. What I really like about what they did with Theon's arc is that he did not, like, trauma is not something you get over a nice, quick pep talk in a brothel from your sister. Like,
Yes.
That's good. That's a good moment from Asha in the show it's Yara, but from his sister in the show, that's a cool moment, and talks about support systems and everything else. But trauma doesn't go away instantly, and so when Theon backslides in the show, when Euron shows up in the silence and he sees all the horror going around him, and he just like breaks, I think that's a really incredible moment.
Mhm.
And so I think that's one of the reasons that we didn't, because even before then, Theon's not ready at the at the moment they take Winterfell to do that to Ramsay. He's still broken and he's still trying to recover. And recovery is not a straight line. And that's something I think the show did very well.
Yes.
Except they went back and they ruined it with the crotch kick or whatever.
I was trying not to talk about that because they did ruin it. They did ruin the backsliding because anatomically that would still really, really, really hurt. So I don't. It's just
especially with if you have a wound there or a scar.
Yeah,
there.
like even if it's not scarred, that's still gonna hurt. Like But we have gone way off the rails.
I don't want to talk about Theon's crotch and Ramsay anymore. But I think that makes perfect sense. That again, the show was just kind of clouding my judgment on and I liked exactly what you said, Frank. That the show made Ramsay a bigger villain than he's a huge villain in the books, but he's a much more important villain in the show. And I think we all know that was consolidating storylines, etc.
Mm-hmm.
But, Euron and the White Walkers, the others, those are the third act villains that are coming and are going to be very important in the Winds of Winter and A Dream of Spring. So it makes sense to, first of all, George has to cut characters and has to wrap up some of these plot lines to begin with. So it makes sense to do away with the Boltons. And if Tywin Lannister can die on a shitter and Joffrey can be poisoned at his wedding, then Ramsay obviously can be thrown in a kennel full of hungry dogs and ripped apart. And I hope George is working right now on that section and adding more gore to it.
Well, hopefully he's beyond that section because early on in the book.
But he jumps around.
Yeah,
he jumps around. But still, yeah. No, hopefully that was like easy writing for him. All right, so there we have laid out to you historical and fictional comparisons for Stannis Baratheon. We have told you that this is a very complicated man who is worth a second look. We've given you historical details of different battles that we think are going to be vital to the Battle of Ice. We've told you how we think a combination of subterfuge and magic and infiltration is going to lead to him taking Winterfell, freeing Winterfell. And it's going to be a great, even if you don't like Stannis Baratheon, that is going to be a great storyline in the Winds of Winter. One of the things I'm most excited for. All right, guys. So anything else for Stannis Baratheon as we wrap up part 1 of our 2-part episode on the One True King?
As always, I'm sure that I'm going to listen to this and kick myself for not thinking of it, but no, I don't have anything else to add.
No,
okay.
I think we're good.
All right. Well, Frank, remind people again where they can find you on social media.
So I have just one little middling post on Reddit under the name Sir Donald Peasbury, which we've discussed kind of at length about what that name means. But then on Twitter, which is where I do most of my ranting in all caps in regards to Stannis in the series, is just at Frank Bumb, B-U-M-B, which we've also discussed the mockery therein previously. So we'll spare the listeners this now. But yeah, go listen to our Danny episodes. Great stuff. But yeah, that's where you can find me, and we'll hopefully have more content for you guys in the future.
All right.
Awesome.
All right. Thanks, Frank.
Yeah. Thanks, guys.
See ya.
Are we good?
Yeah,
we're
good. And this one's good. It's recorded. We're good.
All right. Well, hey, yeah, just call me back if there's any issues, and let me know how episode 2 goes. I mean, I would tell you I'm hoping to get my essay out, but I'm just so fucked right now in terms of workload with law school. Like, it is ramped up. Yeah, it is.
We're going to add a line at the beginning of this episode just to say, it's not out, but when it's out, we'll share it and make sure everyone.
And be sure to call me a lazy bastard. But yeah, it's good.
Well, that's why we're going to record it after you drop off.
Yeah. Fuck off. All right. Well, I'll see you all later. Always a pleasure, gentlemen. I'll talk to you later.
All right.
See you, Frank.
See you.
All right. So
I guess we just need to record a closing.
Yeah. Here, let me pull up.
You want me to do it, or do you want to pull it up?
Yeah, if you could do it. I didn't really.
All right.
Okay. Yeah.
All right. So that concludes part 1 of Stannis at the Gates. Look for part 2 in a couple weeks. Planetos Podcast can be found on iTunes, SoundCloud, Google Play, YouTube, Podbean. Apparently, we're on Podbean now too.
I didn't realize that, but
it was a miracle when we found out.
Well, I actually found out because we got a comment on the last episode we released, and I was like, "Wait a minute!" And it was like in an email, and I was like, "Wait a minute!" Like, I remember setting it up, but I remember it like wanted to charge for something, and
that's right. Yeah, I do remember that. Yeah,
but apparently the SoundCloud RSS feed goes through it. I don't know. Yeah,
perfect.
So whatever.
Perfect. or we're gonna get like this huge bill one day, and we'll be like, "What the hell?"
Yeah,
yeah. So listen to us there. Listen or don't listen, follow us. Follow us on Twitter at planetospodcast. Like us on Facebook. Follow us on Instagram. Check out our Valar Predictus contest, which is going on. It runs for several more weeks, and we want to get some entries in before the start of season 8. So I've been one of your hosts, Travis. You can find me at Sir_Travis on Twitter.
And I do want to add, Travis, for the most part, wrote 2 reviews for Tower of the Hand?
Yeah, we had 2 really fun reviews on Tower of the Hand. They are doing a Game of Thrones episode by episode rewatch. And Brett and I were lucky enough to be able to submit a review of Blackwater, which is actually pretty much based off of some of the thoughts and comments we made back in episode 2, Blackwater's Last Gleaming. And then we also reviewed season 2, episode 10, Valar Morghulis. So that was really fun. Yeah, those were some fun essays to write, and got some fun comments there. So check out Tower of the Hand. Check out those essays there. I think that rewatch runs right up into to April 14th.
All right. And I've been your other host, Brett, and you can find me at Homely Pillow on Twitter. But yeah.
All right. Thank you guys and girls for listening. We'll see you around Planetos.